Hello, everybody, and welcome. This is Sam. I'm excited to talk with Jake Brancatella today. Jake is also known as the Muslim Metaphysician. You can find his YouTube channel and Twitter handle. I'll include that in the description of the video. And I first ran across Jake because he had a conversation with Dr. Bo Branson relating to the Trinity. And I thought that they had a really good conversation, a really kind of good faith, but serious and engaging conversation. So I sort of wanted to follow up on that and perhaps, talk with Jake from a slightly different Christian perspective than I think, is typically found, and also kind of hear his thoughts and sort of hear, his perspective on these things. So I know a little bit about your story from your YouTube channel, but I think it would be helpful for the listeners to hear a little bit where you're coming from. So, kind of what's your biography and sort of what's your faith journey like, and how did you come to arrive at being the Muslim metaphysician?
Right. All right. So just want to thank you, Sam, for having me on the show. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to our conversation. So yeah, my name is Jake Brancatella. I was born and raised pretty much a Roman Catholic, although mostly nominally. Um, I went to Catholic school early on until like first grade. Um, but yeah, I never really, now looking back on it, I never really had a firm faith in the religion. I went to Sunday school and stuff like that, but I didn't really take it that seriously. And then towards my, let's say, like late high school years, early on when I was in college, I started thinking a lot more about God and sort of complex issues. I had a Muslim friend and he introduced me to Islam. And I'm just giving like a short summary. Long
Sure.
story short, I started reading the Qur'an, which is our holy book, and it just made a lot more sense to me. Cleared up some fundamental issues I had with what I thought was mainstream Christianity that I had some issues with. And I mainly embraced it because of its simplicity and its doctrine of who God is. And yeah, so then I kind of moved on from there. I studied philosophy in college, and that kind of piqued my interest in a lot of these bigger questions. And then recently, within the past year or so, I've created a YouTube channel where I discuss, obviously, metaphysics, things related to God, and I talk a lot about the Trinity and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I remember one of your videos, you mentioned something like kind of 3 central problems that you felt like you had with Christianity.
Yeah.
I think it was the doctrine of the Trinity,
Yeah.
the incarnation, and then atonement. Am I
Yeah.
getting that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. So yeah, for me, because for me, metaphysics are primary, so they drive, at least I attempt to, for them to drive my thinking about the text, even as well as history. And for me, fundamentally, at minimum, any doctrine about God or religion has to be logically possible. If it's not coherent, then it's just false. So for me, the Trinity and the Incarnation never really made sense to me, but it was only on a very basic level of just thinking about it like, well, how could God be one and three, or how could Jesus be both fully man and fully God? These kind of things on a very basic level didn't make sense to me. And then over the past maybe 5 years or so, I've been doing a deep dive into these doctrines and reading the works of people like Dr. Bo Branson that you've had on your show, and having debates and dialogues with them. And yeah, just kind of really diving deep into those topics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So Islam is a big world. So what was your journey into Islam like? and sort of what branch or denomination have you found yourself in, and how did you sort of come to those sorts of decisions?
Yeah, so originally, because I didn't know that much, and it was just from reading the Quran and talking to a few people, I originally was in a sect called the Quranists, which are basically, or Quran alone, they go by a bunch of different names, but basically people who just adhere to the Quran as principle of faith, and they don't accept tradition or what we call hadith or sunnah, the sayings and deeds of the prophet. Um, and I was into that for a good about 6 years or so. And then with over the past 2 years, I transitioned to become sort of a traditional Sunni Muslim. And then I've been researching and kind of learning a lot as far as that goes within the past 2 years. So yeah, that's I originally came in from, I guess for the viewers who may not be too familiar, just kind of a broad analogy would be like the Quranists are almost like Protestant Christians in the sense of very like sola scriptura, just
Hmm.
adhering to just the Bible or just the Quran, and kind of rejecting all other quote unquote tradition. Um, of course, it's not a perfect analogy, but just to
Hmm.
give people a rough understanding. And then, yeah, from there, over the past 2 years, I transitioned to be a traditional Sunni Muslim. So that's kind of where I'm at now.
Hmm. And are you part of like well, this year's sort of weird, but are you part of a local congregation that you belong to and,
Mhm.
participate in?
Yeah, so there's a local masjid community center about 10 minutes from my job, where I attend, and they have a lot of classes, very intellectual. I study fiqh, or Islamic jurisprudence law, with a teacher there named Dr. Shadi Al-Masri, and I've been doing that for the past year or so. So that's usually where I attend.
Hmm. Oh,
Mhm.
great. So that's quite a story. I imagine that's a hard thing to explain to friends and family quickly, or I bet you get some funny looks, or perhaps even worse than funny looks, I would suppose, from that sort of journey.
Yeah, I mean, most people, they see me walking down the street when I'm not wearing this hat. They don't know that I'm Muslim. A lot of people, unless I tell them explicitly, they wouldn't really know. I just look like a normal American
Hmm.
guy. But yeah, then when I talk about it with them, oddly enough, most people are not too interested in really hearing about it. But those that are, I have some interesting conversations with them when, I introduce my faith to them and things like that, because a lot of people have a lot of misconceptions about the religion, and a lot of questions about it. So I try to explain it the best way I can.
Sure. So I think pretty high on the list of misconceptions that a lot of American Christians or otherwise would have about Islam is exactly how they view Jesus. So
Mhm.
so what is your, so I guess you've sort of kind of meandered and moved in your understanding of Jesus, but how do you understand Jesus now in the context of your Sunni Islam?
Mhm. Yeah, so nowadays, and pretty much it's been the same even since I became Muslim. The general understanding of Jesus Christ is that he was the Messiah. He's one of the greatest prophets and messengers of God. We don't believe that he was God in any way. We believe that he was a prophet and he was a Messiah. He was sent by God mainly to the children of Israel. And also, one of his duties was to foretell the coming of a future prophet who would be the prophet to the world, basically, which is the prophet Muhammad. And yeah, so that's our general rough sketch of who Jesus Christ is for
Hmm.
us.
So he's a human being, and you would affirm the virgin birth, if I'm correct, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I think not a lot of Christians actually know that Islam, most of it anyway, would affirm the virgin birth and affirm Jesus's status as a great prophet and even as the Messiah.
Yeah.
Although exactly the content of what being the Messiah means might be a little bit different,
Yeah.
but in some respects you affirm the Messiahship of Jesus.
Mhm.
And so I guess another question that so I talked with Dr. Khalil Andani, who belongs to
Mhm.
a pretty different sect of Islam than you. I think he belongs to one of the few sects that would affirm the crucifixion. How
Mhm.
would you understand the crucifixion or the lack of crucifixion, I guess?
Okay, yeah. So there are different opinions about the crucifixion. There's different theories as to what exactly happened. And my general understanding from the Quranic narrative is that Jesus Christ was not crucified in the sense that he was not hung on the cross and died on the cross. Now, as to whether or not he was ever put on a cross, I think that's sort of an open question. It's not all that clear, and there's difference of opinion about it. But what certainly we understand is that he did not die on the cross, and he was not murdered or killed in any manner. So, like the Quran frequently talks about, prophets of old were killed by the Jews and the children of Israel. But God saved Christ, and he did not die. He was not crucified in the sense of dying on the cross. So that's my general understanding. Beyond that, there's a lot of different views. I'd be interested because I really don't know all that much about Dr. Khalil's position about that. So maybe I have to go back and look at the video if you guys discussed it there. But I
Hmm.
am familiar with him, and we're in contact on Messenger and stuff like that. He's a really nice guy.
Yeah, he's an extremely friendly guy, and he's very generous to give his time to people who have questions for him, even sort of, randos like us, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, and so it sounds like you're saying that there's perhaps a little bit of wiggle room in the tradition, but something like he was maybe they attempted to crucify him, but God perhaps assumed him to heaven prior to him actually dying.
Yeah, and then by the means of what actually happened after that, whether somebody else was crucified in his place and people thought it was Jesus, or there's all different theories about exactly what happened. I don't take any hard line stance on that because I think it's largely, um, just theoretical. There's nothing concrete in the tradition about that.
Hmm.
But yeah, so I would just say he wasn't killed or crucified in any manner, and God saved him from that.
And so that would also then deny his bodily resurrection. So if he
Yeah.
didn't die, then he also wasn't resurrected.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, yeah. So I wouldn't believe in the traditional sort of New Testament narrative of Christ dying and then raising again after 3 days. No, nothing like that. Yeah.
Hmm. In your talk with Dr. Branson, you made, I think, what is an important and helpful distinction about how Muslims view Christianity, where
Hmm.
in some sense the Quran and Islamic tradition affirms the validity of the Injeel or the gospel that Jesus preached, that
Hmm.
was a message that God had given him and that he faithfully reported. But that is not the same thing as the contents of the New Testament, if I
Right.
understand you correctly, right? Could you
Right.
explain a little bit how you view and understand that?
Right. And so also recently, just for the viewers, if they're interested in getting a more detailed explanation of this, I think that, and I've spoken to Dr. Khalil, I think we have a very similar understanding of that because I've seen him give an explanation of it online. And he actually saw my discussion with Bo, and he was applauding my explanation of that. So yeah, so my understanding is that, for example, when the term Injeel is used in the Qur'an, it always goes hand in hand with the prophet Jesus. So whatever the Injeel was revealed to Jesus directly. And the general understanding of Revelation is that God basically sends down revelation either directly or through a mediary like an angel. Typically, the angel Gabriel does this, and he brings the message, and it's always oral. It's not like a book just falls out of the sky or from heaven. And it's also not the idea that some Christians have, and I think it's the mainstream Christian view that of inspiration, where so they just write these things down and they're carried by the Holy Spirit. We don't have this understanding. We have an understanding of direct revelation that always is oral and then only is later reduced to writing. And we believe that there were a lot of prophets and messengers, and most of which the messages they received, they would receive the message and then recite it to their people in their language. And most of that was not reduced to writing in the form of books. Now, there are certain books that the Quran mentions, of which those messages were reduced to writing. Now, we know that this has happened with, for example, Moses and the Torah, and also Jesus and the Injeel. But the interesting thing is that every time, for example, the word Injeel, which roughly translated in English just means good news, is always associated with Jesus. So we understand it as a revelation from God to the prophet Jesus, and he would have spoken that out and recited it to the people for them to hear it. The other thing is that, from my understanding, another tip off that the content of the New Testament is not necessarily what the Quran is talking about is that the Quran says that God only sends a messenger with a message that is in the language of him and his people. And we know that Jesus most likely would have been speaking Aramaic. And if that's the case, we would understand that the message that he received would have been in that language. Now, there were people who spoke Greek at that time, and it could be argued maybe that Jesus even knew some Greek. How fluent he was, I don't think we can say for sure. But I think the Quranic narrative would be clear that the original revelation wouldn't have been in Greek, and it was only associated with Jesus, not Paul or Timothy or Matthew, Luke, John, any of these other New Testament writers. The Quran does not affirm these things, but it does reference the Injeel. So the interesting question Christians have is, well, how can it refer to the Injeel if we don't really have directly necessarily what Jesus wrote down or anything like that? And so I would say that the New Testament quotes Jesus all the time. So like if Christians are familiar with a red letter Bible, exactly what Jesus supposedly said. Now, obviously, there are some discrepancies from even within Jesus' words that are transmitted through the New Testament. We wouldn't necessarily agree with them and affirm all of those statements, but generally we would be more comfortable with what Jesus actually said. And then we would go through a process of historical analysis to see, well, even the things that are claimed in the New Testament that Jesus said, how sure can we be that he actually said those things? But generally speaking, the Injeel has to do specifically with Jesus Christ and the revelation that he brought, and not necessarily the New Testament writers. And then the Quran is sort of like a conveyor belt that you can think of, where it is, the Quran calls itself the Furqan, which basically means the criterion. So it kind of picks out the things that are correct from previous revelation and affirms them in this new revelation of the Quran. So what we would say is the things that definitively agree with what the Quran is saying, we would affirm that they are revelation. The things that completely contradict what the Quranic narrative is, for example, Jesus being the Son of God, the Quran rejects this type of language, or that Jesus is God. We would openly reject that. And then the things which the Quran is silent about or doesn't really say one way or another, we are told to be silent about that as well. So that's kind of a rough sketch of my understanding of the Injeel and how it relates to the Quranic revelation.
Sure. So if I'm understanding you correctly, the New Testament itself is not divinely inspired in your view, but Jesus's gospel that he would have received through an oral revelation, either angelic or otherwise, was, and that the New Testament might contain pieces of that
Yeah.
with varying degrees of accuracy, perhaps. And
Right.
that then the Quran sort of later comes along and kind of sorts the wheat from the chaff in terms of what got mixed up by the Jesus followers who created the New Testament.
Right. That's pretty much correct. And another way I said it to Bo, I think, if I remember correctly in our discussion, was that even in the New Testament, you hear the word gospel, and that has a certain connotation. Now, obviously, even the gospel that you might affirm may be different than the way I understand it, but there is a sense in which the gospel that Jesus brought and what was, he was a revelation himself in terms of Christian terminology, but the gospel that he brought and preached, there is a qualitative difference between that and, for example, what Paul is writing to these different churches. There's a distinction between those two things. So I would say that gives maybe a helpful analogy and understanding of what we would say is the Injeel or the gospel, the revelation that was given to Christ, although we obviously would distinguish or disagree on some of the content of what that actually was.
Right, like, because if you imagine the New Testament being written between, say, the years 50 and 90 AD, there's still about a 20-year period where Christianity is seemingly purely oral or pretty close to it, right? And the book of Acts talks about, the early apostles and evangelists running around and spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ, right? Or sometimes
Right.
the word of God was another way that they would refer to it, right?
Mhm.
And so that you can imagine that as being sort of this oral, learned hand to hand, sort of mouth to ear sort of message. And so what you're saying, well, and maybe you might say that even the apostles might have started to bungle it pretty quickly, I guess. But
Mhm.
something like that even Christians would say that there was an oral phase of Christianity before the writings of the New Testament.
Yeah, that's 100% right. So I think even conservative Christians would agree with that there was an oral phase, and that there is a distinction between what that oral content was at that time and what's contained in the New Testament. Now, obviously, uh, taking it on faith, the Christian faith would say that the New Testament authors tried to capture that, or maybe they had access to that oral tradition in some sense. There's all different kinds of theories about that. And I'm not a textual critic or a scholar by
Mm-hmm.
any means. But yeah, so I would say that definitely I think that helps people to understand what we mean by Injeel and what the Quran affirms, because some people get confused, or even sometimes you have certain Christian apologists making a certain argument that the Quran affirms the Injeel and the Torah, and it tells Christians and Jews to follow it. So, in some sense, the Quran is kind of shooting itself in the foot because it's also telling them to follow the Quran. But the main point that I think I'd like Christians to understand is to look at those texts, because there's maybe only, I don't know off the top of my head, maybe 10 times that the word Injeel is mentioned. Look at them and look at what the context is, and you'll see that it's always associated with Jesus specifically. So my argument, and I think Dr. Andani would agree with me, is that there's certainly the author of the Quran, whether you want to say, I mean, of course, I believe it's God, but whether you want to say it was Muhammad or somebody else, the author does not expect or understand that there's some kind of one-for-one correspondence between the Injeel and the New Testament. That's just a totally foreign idea.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's also an interesting question to think about what forms of Christianity were around in the context of, you know, the early Islamic period in Muhammad's life and the lifetime of his successors, and what they were describing and interacting with, and perhaps in some ways reacting against.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
Yeah.
that the answer is much more complicated than it was just straight up Eastern Orthodoxy or something like that. I think there was lots of different kinds of Christianity around. And I
Yeah.
think the Arabian Peninsula especially had sort of a hodgepodge of different kind of Christian sects that don't exist anymore.
Oh, yeah, that's certainly true. I'm sure there was historical development. Pretty much it's the same with any faith tradition. There's different sects very early on. You have that even in Islam. There were different groups that separated from each other, and different perspectives on the law and all kinds of things. I mean, it's clear even in some of Paul's writings in the early church, there were some differences. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that to the extent of what actually that was and what these groups are, yeah, that's definitely a question for historians. I couldn't say with any certainty as to what exactly that was, but there were definitely different groups, as you said, around the prophet at that time, who he met, what their beliefs were. A lot of that is going to be a matter of history, trying to go back in and see, and the best we can formulate what that would have been. But yes, it's very difficult to do.
Right. And I think another thing, there were maybe only a handful of Christian texts that were available in Arabic at that time. I think there was almost certainly not a full New Testament in the Arabic language during the lifetime of Muhammad, right? That's an
Hmm.
interesting thing to think about, that there were
Yeah.
Christianities in Muhammad's context that were either had very little text or perhaps almost even no text, right?
Hmm.
And so that brings, I don't know, that puts Muhammad's, you know, saying, you know, the Injeel of Jesus in a slightly
Hmm.
different context, right? Obviously there were branches of Christianity that had the full-fledged New Testament, but I think there
Hmm.
was only a handful of languages that had been translated into at that time. And
Hmm.
so large parts of the Christian world actually didn't have a full New Testament, or perhaps even much of any canon or scripture in their own language.
Right. So, I mean, even at that time, probably the common people, much of their practice and faith would have been transmitted orally. I mean, they would have
Yeah.
been told certain stories, and I think that's just natural for the ancient world. I mean, it is interesting, though, that John of Damascus, and this might be something Christians who are not familiar with Islam may be interested in. John of Damascus was pretty early on after the prophet. He wrote about the Muslims. He basically seemed to think that they were not necessarily like a entirely different religion, but because they were so, or he felt anyway, that they were close to Christians in many respects and what they believed and what they said. He called them like Christian heretics.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
was like a false sect of Christianity. Now, a lot of Christians who are not too familiar with Islam, they may be shocked by that statement, because they really think, well, these people believe in this Allah. Who is this? It's
Hmm.
just a separate like God, nothing to do with the God of the Bible. But yeah, I mean, one of the earliest Christian writers to, and don't get me wrong, he totally disagreed with Islam, but he wrote on it in a way that he saw enough similarities to say, well, this doesn't even really seem like a totally different religion. These are just like some Christian heretics.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
It wasn't like John of Damascus had the category of not Christian religion, right?
yeah,
There was paganism, and then he
yeah.
could have put it in like a similar category as Judaism, right?
Hmm.
As in like a monotheistic but not Christian religion,
Hmm.
but it's in the category of Christian heresy, right?
Yeah.
And so
So that's
I
pretty
think that's
interesting.
interesting. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I also think and suspect that some of the Christian sects that were around in Arabia at that time were non-Trinitarian forms of Christianity that
Hmm.
also didn't like the Trinity. And I
Hmm.
think that some of the stuff in the Quran that is anti-Trinitarian is actually probably things that Christians in the area, or at least some of them, would have agreed with. And
Hmm.
so I think that the especially early on, there was a much fuzzier boundary, I think, between how Christianity, Islam, and the various sects viewed and understood themselves.
Right, exactly. And John of Damascus may have viewed some of those Christian sects that you're talking about in a similar light of the Muslims rejecting
Right.
the Trinity and these kind of things, and just saying, well, they seem kind of similar. So maybe they're just Christian heretics too. They're just
Yeah,
like a
yeah.
false sect.
It's
Yeah.
this new emerging folk country bumpkin Christianity that's similar to those other wrong kinds of Christianity that are already out there. I think that was probably somewhat similar to how he would have thought of it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Hmm. So yeah. So I guess transitioning a little bit, um, how does so this is a particularly interesting question from my perspective for a biblical Unitarian, because like I'm always getting sort of pressure from Trinitarian Christians that I like don't think of Jesus as special enough, basically.
Hmm.
And just sort of what language you can use to describe a prophet or a messiah that is not making them God but is still making them pretty special. And
Hmm.
that was one of the things I really enjoyed talking with Dr. Andani about, is sort of the way that kind of, I don't know, they view, I don't know, I guess the intersection of holiness and humanity, or you almost might even say divinity, but that's a
Hmm.
word that I'll leave off to the side for now.
Hmm.
So I was wondering how do you understand and how do you articulate the specialness of people like Jesus and Muhammad, and how are they connected to God, and how is their status perhaps different from other humans, and that sort of thing?
Hmm. Well, I mean, obviously, our understanding of the prophets, I would say, is a bit different than the biblical portrayal at times. But generally, prophets and messengers, they receive a message from God. Their number one duty is basically to proclaim it to the people and obviously to follow it. But we believe that the messengers and prophets all came with the same basic message, and that is to worship and serve one God alone and to follow his commandments. So that's kind of the basic idea of the prophets. But in terms of their moral character, we typically, and there's different opinions about on it, but the general view at minimum is that the prophets, in terms of their moral character, were almost impeccable. So you have this idea that they're either sinless, or if they did commit sins, they were only minor sins or certain mistakes or errors they made, but nothing like that we would consider a very serious or major sin like murder or adultery and things like this. Now, I know that in the Bible, or at least my understanding, especially in the Old Testament, the prophets weren't up to our standards in terms of morality and following God's commands.
Sure, like
So,
Abraham and Moses and David are all described as doing pretty sinful things at various points in their lives in the Old
yeah.
Testament.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, David at times it could be argued that he had his mistress's husband murdered and certain things like that. We would say that we would reject those stories, and we don't really view the prophets in that light. So I see what you're saying. It's interesting you brought this up because I was talking to a Christian friend of mine earlier, just a couple hours ago, about this exact subject, and kind of the difference, I think, at least in what he was saying to me, is that, especially with Jesus, is that, um, well, not especially with Jesus, I should say the other prophets, the fact that they were sinners was actually, I wouldn't say a good thing, but because of that, they had a unique way to be able to relate to the common people in a way that he thinks that the messengers or the prophets of Islam, it seems to be almost like a mismatch. They can't really relate as much because they're not going around committing adultery and killing people when they shouldn't be, and these kind of things. But I view it the opposite way, that you can think of it almost as like a miracle, where we believe that Jesus, for example, did many miracles, and other prophets as well. And so part of that package, so to speak, of being a prophet is the miracle of their moral character. They're not absolutely perfect in a way like that God is, because they do make mistakes, but they are certainly free of any major sins. And so we, in my mind, hold them to a slightly higher standard. One of the most important things is that they were impeccable in terms of delivering the message. So they couldn't be people who were known to be liars, or to purposely change God's word or manipulate certain things. We don't believe anything like that, and we believe that um, I don't know about the Jewish, but because I'm more familiar with the Christian understanding of the prophets, but um, certainly the Christian understanding of the prophets and some of their actions and behavior, we would find problematic, to say the least. So I hope that answers your
No,
question.
sure. So,
Yeah.
so you view the prophets as sinless or close to it, and
Mhm.
that this is, it's important, at least in the sense of sort of being able to protect the honor and reliability of the revelations that they receive.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
it's not just that the prophets are like some conduit for God, and other than that, they're, it's just the words that come out of their mouth. Other than that, you can just ignore them. It's their lives that are also noteworthy and important, and in some
Yeah.
sense reveal something of, perfect human moral character in their, actions and their life.
Yeah, that's right. Because for us, they're not just like some kind of mailman or anything like that. Certainly not
Hmm.
in traditional Sunni Islam. The Prophet is meant to be a sort of standard or example that we look at. I mean, even in the Qur'an, Abraham is mentioned as an example for the Prophet Muhammad. So we look at them as examples of how we should act, how should we um, abide by God's commands and follow them, and all these things. They're very important to us, because without that, it would be very difficult for us. We maybe be at loss sometimes of how to implement certain things or what we should do in certain situations. So we look at the prophetic tradition, especially in terms of the prophet Muhammad, because we believe that he's the last prophet for us. That's where the hadith and the sunnah comes in, because we have many examples of his life, of how he chose certain things in certain situations that give us an understanding of what we should do if that same situation is presented to us. So yes, that's definitely important that we know what the prophet's example is, and we try to follow it as best as we can.
Hmm. So would you say that it would be fair to say that something like the prophets are living embodiments of sort of God's wisdom or moral standard for human beings?
Yes, definitely. We would say for us, because the Prophet Muhammad is the last prophet, because so we believe that each prophet was before the prophet was sent to a specific people, and then since he's the last prophet, he's sent to all mankind. So for us, he is sort of the moral standard that we look for of how to behave, and as you're saying, he was basically I think there's a hadith that says he was a walking Qur'an. So he's basically the walking embodiment of God's word on earth.
Uh-huh.
Not
That's
yeah,
not that dissimilar from how biblical Unitarians will understand the phrase "the Word made flesh" about Jesus, right?
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's very interesting. Um, and so how, I guess, how is there any sort of explanation for how this moral perfection is achieved or where it comes from? Is there some, I don't know, anointing or divine emanation or something that sort of protects them from sin, or how exactly is that understood, or how does that work?
So my understanding is that I mean, I don't know if we use this language necessarily, but I understand it as kind of like a miracle from God in the sense that um, it's talked about in Islamic theology that God sort of takes the heart of the prophet and takes it out and washes it, cleanses it. It's sort of like a purification that God does to the prophet's heart, and so he makes him in such a way that this is natural for the prophets to exhibit his word on earth and the correct moral character. So yeah, it's because without God doing that, like regular people like you and I, we're sinners. I'm sure we sin all the time, um, because we are not touched by God in that special way that they are. So that's the way I see it.
Sure. Okay. And then just maybe a couple other questions, and I'll transition to maybe talking about the Trinity. Does your tradition pray to prophets or saints, or venerate them in any way, or is prayer only ever directed to God?
Mhm. So my position is that prayer should only be directly to God. Um, there are different things where the prayer would be, for example, to God, but trying to think of how to say it in English. Basically like with the seal of or blessings of a saint or a prophet, like
Prayer in the
using
name of a saint or a prophet, you might say.
yeah, like with the status of say the Prophet Muhammad or things like that. So there are a lot of people that do that. I personally am not really that comfortable with it. So I would pray. I mean, even that is a prayer. They would argue it's a prayer to God, but sort of trying to use the status of that quote
It's
unquote
like
saint or
invoking
prophet.
the intercession, perhaps, of
Yeah,
that particular prophet.
right. Yeah. So, I mean, people are on both sides of the aisle on that. A lot of people take a very staunch stance and say to do that is, shirk, what we would call shirk, or like polytheism. I personally am not comfortable with it, so I don't do it myself.
Hmm.
But I understand where that's coming from. You have that a lot in, especially in Catholicism, with the saints, and praying with different saints for different things depending on what it is. So
Hmm.
that seems to be like a common human idea that we sort of come up with almost. But I myself am not really comfortable with that. I just pray directly to God because if God can't help me, nobody else can. That's the way I
Hmm.
look at it.
Sure. Sure. and so is there ever like honor or accolades or words of praise or anything along those lines given to these sort of human saints or prophets, either
Mhm.
part of a religious ceremony or service or otherwise?
Yeah, definitely. So, like, when you hear Muslims speak, even myself, if I speak about a prophet, technically, we should be saying "peace be upon him," or there's an Arabic phrase that goes along with it. So, like when I say the Prophet Muhammad, I should say "peace be upon him" after his name is mentioned. And this goes with Prophet Jesus, "peace be upon him," Abraham, all the prophets and messengers. So that's a form of, uh, trying to, I don't know if I would say venerate, but I don't know what the right word is, but
Yeah, yeah.
definitely giving them the proper respect, even upon mentioning their names, is very important for us. As far as saints, besides prophets, I myself don't really do that in terms of saying those type of things, but we would say like in Arabic we would say God have mercy upon that person, or God bless that person, things like that. We, upon mentioning their names, it's almost like a prayer for that person every time we mention them, because we see that as beneficial for that person in terms of his status with God. We say, just like in English, you say, well, God have a mercy on that person's soul and things like that. So that's sort of the things that, like, even when we mention uh, well-known Islamic scholars will say, Rahim Allah, like God have mercy upon that person. So
Hmm.
that's something that we do as sort of a ritual almost, when we talk about these people that are important in our tradition.
Yeah, sure, sure. That's really interesting because this is one of those things like almost all biblical Unitarians I know are American and then came out of evangelical Protestantism mostly, or perhaps grew up in biblical Unitarianism. And it's like, I feel like a lot of religions, like, Judaism, early Christianity, Islam, kind of had that sort of thing in it where you could give honor to human beings and prophets and saints and stuff like that, but it was like
Hmm.
some category not short of worship, but
Hmm.
more than just like thinking they were a swell fellow. And
Hmm.
and that sort of language and practice is sort of lost in most of Protestantism. It's like either you're God or you're nothing, really.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so that it's kind of uncomfortable sometimes for biblical Unitarians to exactly understand how Jesus fits in, right?
Hmm.
And I feel like looking at some of these other religious practices like Islam and Judaism and other sorts of things, it's sort of there are common recurring manifestations of how to do this that
Hmm.
are short of making the person God themselves.
Yeah.
And so I think it's useful to hear you talk about that. Although I
Hmm.
still suspect that biblical Unitarians will treat Jesus even perhaps a little bit more specially
Hmm.
than you might feel comfortable with. And
Hmm.
that's an interesting distinction, because you would never worship a
Hmm.
human being, a saint or a prophet or what have you.
Hmm. I mean, I certainly wouldn't. I'm sure there's probably some people that do, but yeah, generally in Islam, we would not worship anything but God alone, and to do
Hmm.
otherwise, it would be a huge problem for us. So yeah,
Hmm.
definitely.
Because if I remember correctly, and if I understood Dr. Khalil Andani a little bit, and I think that his sect is a little bit, perhaps it's the furthest in this direction of all of the forms of Islam, but they have their view of their imams that are a hereditary succession from, I think it's Ali or the
Hmm.
cousin or something. I think it's the cousin of Muhammad, and
Hmm.
will bow down, I believe, before the living imam and stuff like that, and sort of worship God through the imam. I hope I'm not mischaracterizing anything. I hope I'm getting that
Hmm.
right. But honestly, I found that to be a pretty similar analog to how biblical Unitarians think of Jesus, and how we sort of venerate, honor, worship
Hmm.
Jesus. And honestly, there's sort of internal dissension sometimes within biblical Unitarianism about how exactly to articulate this and word this. But
Hmm.
I think part of it is because Protestantism just sort of lost the language of how to talk about that.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that much about Dr. Andani's sect to really comment on it. But yeah, I mean, there's just people who worship at graves of saints. There's people who do all kinds of rituals, whether you consider it worship or praying to the person or all these kind of things. It's you definitely will find it out there. Like I said, I myself, I'm not. I guess I'm a little bit more strict. I'm not
Hmm.
as comfortable with it, so
Hmm.
I don't really engage in any of that kind of stuff. But
Hmm.
yeah, so that's what I say, because I really don't know that much about Dr. Andani's sect to really comment on to what they do as far as worshiping the imam and stuff like that. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess sort of transitioning to the next topic, you certainly know your stuff when it comes to talking about the Trinity, I'll say. I was really surprised at how much detail you and thought you had put into this, especially evident in your conversation with Dr. Branson. So, I mean,
Mhm.
I can kind of understand from your history and your background and your story why that would be the case. But how did you get so interested in the topic of the Trinity in particular?
Mhm. So, like I said earlier when we were talking, three fundamental things that were problematic for me, but just on a surface level, were the Trinity, the Incarnation, and Atonement. And that kind of stuck with me even when I was a Muslim, because I could understand at a very, as I'm saying, basic level why it didn't make sense. But I felt like, well, how can I properly express that? Because if I want to talk to Christians and be able to articulate an argument very clearly and decisively, it has to be more to it than just saying, hey, this doesn't make sense.
Hmm.
So, and especially because I have a background in philosophy, um, it kind of intrigued me when I was in university. And then, especially over the past few years, I've been doing a lot of research on specifically the Trinity and Incarnation. Eventually, I'll get more in depth with the atonement. Um, but yes, I've been reading a lot as far as the different models of the Trinity and the differences between the two, all the different models, and what sort of the are the pros and cons of each models, and reading the back and forth between different scholars like Dr. Bo Branson and Dale Tuggy, for example. I think you've had on your show, and reading what they're saying about all these things. And what I realize is, whoa, this is a lot more. If I want to make a strong argument against people like Dr. Branson, I got to really do my research and dig my head into this stuff. It's not as easy as saying, hey, Bo, 1 + 1 + 1 = 3, not one. You know, because that's sort of like the common general Muslim argument that they'll give. So I wanted to really dig more deeply into it, and first of all better understand where the Trinitarian perspective is coming from, because even though I rejected it, I didn't even know there were different models of the Trinity or different ways of looking at it. And I've only discovered that over the past few years. And it's just really kind of, I don't know, I just love it. I love reading about it. So I'm really interested in it. And yeah, I enjoy talking about it, making videos about it on my YouTube.
Hmm.
And yeah, that's kind of how it happened.
Sure. So what in your mind, what are sort of the major categories or types of Trinity theories? And what kind of strikes you as perhaps their strengths and weaknesses?
Mhm. So there's different names for these models, but the two general families, and I'm being very broad here, so the people who are really academic, I hope they won't beat me up too much. But the two general fields, and Dr. Branson talks about this in his thesis, are basically what's known as social Trinitarianism and relative identity Trinitarianism. They also go by other names like Latin Trinitarianism versus Greek Trinitarianism. So they go by these different names, but social Trinitarianism is basically the idea that the persons of the Trinity are to be understood in a very robust, modern sense of what it means to be a person. And a lot of what they understand is taken from modern psychology and understanding of how the brain works and how people think and stuff like that. So the persons in social Trinitarianism are really detailed, like it's thought of as a basically a center of self-consciousness that has a will and is able to have emotions between the different persons and so on. So that's like the key distinctive feature of social Trinitarianism. On the other hand, relative identity Trinitarianism is basically the thesis that, at least in terms of the Trinity, identity is relative. So I don't know how familiar you are with things like Leibniz's law, or the idea that whatever is true of X, if it's true of Y, then they're identical. They're
Mhm.
exactly the same thing. If they differ in any property, then they're just not the same thing. And so there are different forms of relative identity Trinitarianism, but the common feature amongst them is that uh, the strict law of identity, the classical law of identity, and Leibniz's law doesn't hold when it comes to the Trinity. So it can't be applied to the Trinity. Now, some people have gone even further to say that the law of identity just doesn't even make sense. It doesn't hold for anything. This was a Catholic theologian by the name of Peter Geach. It was kind of his thesis. I think he came out with it in the 60s, and he had a very strong opinion to say that not only does it law of identity not hold for the Trinity, it doesn't even make sense to talk about, like, for example, are Superman and Clark Kent the same? He would say that that question is meaningless. You can only make sense of identity when you reference a sort of thing. So you would say, are they the same person or are they the same man? Only when you get specific does the question even make sense. But people like Peter Van Inwagen, who is a contemporary Christian philosopher who defends a version of relative identity Trinitarianism, he wouldn't take such a hardline stance. He leaves it open as to whether the classic law of identity holds for other things apart from the Trinity. But what he would say is that for the Trinity, it doesn't hold. And so he comes up with this sort of relative identity logic and way to explain, what the Trinity is. And so he would say that the persons in the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Spirit, they're the same God, but they're different persons. And so when we put this into logical language, they would say that if, for example, if we're comparing the Father and the Father is A, the Son is B. They would say that A and B, the Father and the Son, are the same G, they're the same God, but they're different P's, they're different persons. And for a classical understanding of the law of identity in Leibniz's law, that just doesn't make sense, because to say that you're the same thing in one category, to say that you're the same F, just means to say that the two things are numerically identical. So, for example, if I have, for example, I have a Dodge Challenger. If Sam, you have a Dodge Challenger, we have the exact same model, exact same year, same interior, same color, same mileage, same everything as far as much as you could possibly think of. They're the same, and we asked, well, are they the same car? Well, to me, the obvious answer is no, because they differ in terms of their properties.
Mm,
Um, my car is in New Jersey. Your car may be somewhere else. I don't know,
mhm,
but it's definitely not in the exact same spatial location as mine. My car might have a certain more mileage that is on it than yours. So the fact that they differ in any way, we would say, well, hey, yeah, they are two Dodge Challengers, but the fact is, they're two things. They're not one thing. And so relative identity Trinitarianism basically rejects this idea when it comes to the Trinity. It would say it can't be applied. So they would say it's the same God, but it's different persons. Now, Dale Tuggy has written on this, and he's done a podcast on this that people might find interesting. They can check that out for more information. But so that's kind of the two broad schools. Is the distinctive feature of social Trinitarianism is this really robust definition and understanding of what it means to be a person in terms of the Trinity, and relative identity Trinitarianism is what I just explained, that relative identity is relative and it doesn't obey the classical law of identity when it comes to the Trinity. So I hope that makes sense. And then we can
yeah,
go into a bit more detail as what are the
yeah.
possible pros and cons of each.
Yeah, I feel like that's a very good description. I feel like with social Trinitarianism, the cost that needs to be paid is you basically define God as a group, right?
Mhm.
God is no longer personal. He's like the meta personal or something like that, or he's the thing that comes out of a group identity, right? And
Mhm.
I think really at the end of the day, I think that's a deeply unsatisfying definition for God. And really,
Mhm.
it's hard not to accuse social Trinitarians of just being tritheists, of really just having three
Yeah.
gods.
Yeah.
And they always are trying to get away from that accusation with varying degrees of
Mhm.
success. And so you kind of, to be a social Trinitarian, you kind of have to throw the definition of God under the bus a little bit, I feel like.
Yeah.
To be a relative identity Trinitarian, I feel like you need to throw the laws of logic under the bus a little bit and say
Mhm.
that either in general or in this specific case, normal logic doesn't work. And,
Mhm.
and it's honestly, it gives me a little bit of a headache to try and understand relative identity theory for too long.
Yeah.
And then there's like sort of what you might say various versions of one self Trinitarianism, which
Mhm.
are always basically just modalism, but they're trying to figure out some way that they can get around the accusation of being modalist. And I feel
Mhm.
like they never exactly particularly succeed. And they
Mhm.
struggle with the idea of sort of interpersonal interactions, like Jesus praying to the Father or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. That's a biblical issue that they have. And yeah, I agree. Sort of the downfalls to each particular school of Trinitarianism is that the main issue that social Trinitarianism has to deal with is polytheism, or how their understanding is doesn't result in there being three gods, is because they make each person so well defined and almost so independent of one another that it runs the risk of polytheism, where there being three
Yeah,
gods.
it's like, how
Um,
is it different than there being like Zeus, Hera, and Apollo, right? It's like
yeah,
they were all part of the same family,
yeah,
but that was
yeah.
polytheism. It's not like there
Mhm.
was somehow one god that emerged out of the Greek pantheon.
Yeah, exactly. So it's been said by people like Brian Lefdow that it's pretty much just paganism,
Yeah.
with a Christian veneer on it. And so yeah, there's been, and the interesting thing is that Trinitarians on both sides these two views are sort of mutually exclusive, like they negate the other view. You can't accept both of them. You have to kind of pick one or other of the theories. And so it's an interesting dynamic how the Christian scholars who represent each one of these interact with each other and criticize each other, in an academic fashion, but explain why they think each other's model is wrong. And so I take a look at that because I'm sort of a nerd when it comes to this. I'm really interested in the different models, and I read, the different scholars, what they say, and interacting with the different views. But yes, I mean, the main problem with social Trinitarianism that is found in the literature, as far as I can tell, is it has to contend and explain, well, how is this not three gods? Like, what is it about these three that makes it one God? Now, like Richard Swinburne will say, well, because they all sort of get along well, like they're just a happy family. And for me, it just seems too thin of a definition of monotheism. Like, why couldn't we have 10 persons then? And as long as they all as long as their wills all agree with one another and they never like fight with each other, well, then it's still
Right.
only one God. Like, it's just a
And
happy
then
family.
and then there's the who is God problem, right? Like if you're just
Yeah.
talking about God and you're using personal pronouns and personal language, it's like, well, who would that refer to then? All of them together, well, then you would use, plural pronouns, not singular, right? And so it doesn't pass that test either.
Yeah, and then for example, William Lane Craig is a social Trinitarian, and he has a model that's called Trinity monotheism, and he does exactly what you said, that in fact, each of the persons are not individually God, but the Trinity as a whole is the only thing that is truly what the divine nature is. And so the problem that results from that, or one of the problems that anyway, is this idea of partialism, which he literally says that each one of the persons are parts of God in the same way that a skeleton of a cat is a part of the cat.
I've heard him use that exact analogy. You're right.
Yeah. And for me, and for even a lot of other Christians, this is just uncomfortable. It doesn't seem right, because if you're a Trinitarian, one of the things you want to say is that the Father is really God. And so if the Trinity is the only thing that is really God over and above the persons in the ultimate sense, well, then that downgrades each of the persons to sort of this lesser divinity. There's two ways to be divine, and the Trinity is God or divine in a way that each of the persons individually aren't. And that just seems to be, if you're a Trinitarian, I know you wouldn't necessarily agree with this, Sam, but if you're a Trinitarian, it doesn't even seem to comport with the Bible, because you want to say that each one of the persons are God in the ultimate sense. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different problems with it, sort of any way you slice it, depending on the specific model. But yeah, broadly speaking, social Trinitarians have a difficult time of explaining, like you said, who is God in this scheme, and then also how there's only one God. And then on the flip side, relative identity Trinitarianism almost goes sort of the opposite direction. And I'm being very general here, so please forgive me. But almost goes sort of the opposite view of it. It defines the persons in such a vague way that almost has the risk of blending them together and almost resulting in modalism. And I think, and maybe we'll get to it with Dr. Branson's model, but I think this is one of the problems maybe that his model can possibly run into, is that you make the person so much alike in every possible way that you can come up with, that's like, well, wait, I mean, what actually is the difference between the Father and the Son? And I mean, especially when you bring in the idea of perichoresis into it, then it's like, whoa, I mean, what is really the difference? So yeah, the fundamental thing they have to answer is, they have an easier time of explaining how there's only one God, or who is God, but they have a much more difficult time of explaining, well, how exactly there are three persons. And so, yeah, I mean, those are just sort of the two opposite sides of the spectrum.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk about Bo Branson's monarchical Trinitarianism, because honestly, I have to say that I just think that his model is just so much clearly better than the others that it's almost like, if you're going to be a Trinitarian, like, checkmate, he won, right? Not and not that Bo Branson would take credit for it, right? He's, I think, because there's also the historical question, right? Like, William Lane Craig, so you invented a new model of the Trinity yesterday, like, so what? Doesn't it have to connect with previous Christian history to, like, matter and count?
Mhm.
So there's that
Yeah.
problem. And to an extent, social Trinitarianism is also dubiously innovative, and relative identity theory is also dubiously innovative. And
Mhm.
so I think that's another question. Like, it has to plug into history and Christian, doctrinal development and authority somewhere, and
Mhm.
probably it should be earlier than the 20th century. And
Mhm.
so I think that's another problem. So I like Bo Branson's model because, it really actually does seem to be what, like, say, the Cappadocian Fathers and the sort of host of characters around them believed.
Mhm.
You can call one person God and know who you're talking about, and it seems to conform with how the Bible talks in general. Um,
Mhm.
but I've talked with Bo a handful of times, and so I'll probably end up being actually a little bit more critical of him than I'm used to. I
Mhm.
sometimes find it easier to criticize people when I'm not directly talking to them. Um, Maybe you know what I'm talking
That'll
about.
probably happen when I leave too.
Yeah. But yeah, I still feel like there are some issues. So I
Mhm.
guess, I suspect a good majority of my listeners maybe are familiar, but if you just had to sort of summarize Bo Branson's understanding of the Trinity, how would you put it?
Mhm. So, I mean, Bo wrote a whole thesis on what he called the logical problem of the Trinity, and which he tried to explain, sort of eventually he explained what his answer to the problem was, and he tried to use um, Gregory of Nyssa as, I'm sorry, not Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzus, as his historical sort of anchor point into how he understands the Trinity. And so his way of ultimately explaining it, of how exactly there's one God, is because there's only one will in the Trinity. Okay. And there's a difference of opinion amongst Trinitarians. Some models um, propose the idea that there's three wills, and that corresponds with each one of the persons. Dr. Branson has the idea that there's only one will in the Trinity, and that all actions start with the Father, okay, and the Son and the Spirit obviously cooperate and engage in the same, what he calls token action, as what the Father does. So he gives this interesting example of three painters. I don't know if you've have
Yeah.
heard this thing, and he explains that because there's only one work or one energy being performed, that there really only is one actor. So he would say that the name of God refers to a sort of activity that an individual undergoes, and because they're engaged in the exact same token activity, there's only one actor, or there's only one God. And people who aren't familiar with Bo's dissertation, they would say, well, wait, that sounds different than how we've typically heard him explain monarchical Trinitarianism. On the other hand, the who is God problem, how he answers that is, he says that the Father alone is God in sort of the ultimate sense, because of the fact that he is the only uncaused cause, whereas the Son and the Spirit are caused by the Father. And they understand this as an eternal causation. C.S. Lewis gives the example of sort of a book stacked on top of another book. And so just imagine that these three books are stacked on top of each other eternally. And there's this eternal relationship that the second book depends upon the first book for its position, in the way that the first book obviously doesn't depend upon the second for its position. And actually, I have a quote here from Gregory of Nyssa in his work called Not Three Gods. He says that the principle of causality distinguishes then the persons of the Holy Trinity. It affirms that the one is uncaused while the other depends on the cause. So the idea is that the one that's uncaused is the Father, and the Son and the Spirit depend on the Father, i.e., they're caused by the Father to exist, even though it's eternal. Now, us in the modern day have a very difficult time of understanding what eternal causation would even look like. But let's just grant them this understanding for the sake of the discussion.
Yeah,
and
an
say,
analogy that I sometimes use to explain it to modern people would be like, let's say the laws of mathematics are eternal, and perhaps the laws of physics depend on the laws of mathematics. And maybe the laws of chemistry depend and are caused by the laws of physics, and the laws of biology are like caused by the laws of chemistry. But it's not like a sequence, right, where like math happens and then a little bit later physics and then a little bit later chemistry and a little bit later biology. It's sort of like, I don't know, logical priority and dependence or something like that. And that's actually something that, you know, a modern person, that's an example. I feel like a modern scientifically oriented person would be like, oh yeah, okay, I think I sort of understand what you mean. Or like the same sort of way that the conclusion of a mathematical proof is caused by the premises of the mathematics, right? But you know, you kind of have to follow through the sequence. But it's like, yeah, we might, when we do a proof in time, yeah, we kind of write it out. But in some eternal sense, right, you know, the all conclusions of mathematics follow from their premises and are caused eternally or something like that. So I actually, when I first encountered Bo Branson, I had trouble understanding or really buying, really, I guess, this idea of eternal causation. But it makes a little bit more sense, I think, once you get a little bit used to it.
Yeah, you just have to understand, obviously the key word is eternal, because like the Nicene Creed says that, and this is where, although obviously they think it's originally in the Bible, but even in the Nicene Creed, you have the idea that the Son is eternally begotten of the Father, that it's true God from true God, true light from true light. So it's, you know, it's the understanding very early on, and the people who are responsible for writing the creeds had this on historical understanding. So I agree with Bo in the sense that a lot of the early church fathers were very comfortable with this notion of eternal causation, and they spoke of the Father as the only uncaused cause, and the Son and the Spirit were caused. But I'm sure if you noticed in my discussion with Bo, I take issue with this because I think it casts a serious problem for one of the classical attributes of God, which is known as aseity, or sort of self-existence. You exist in and of yourself and not through another. So in this scheme, the Father is the only one that has aseity, which Dr. Branson admitted he had no problem actually saying that. Only the Father has aseity, or existence in and of himself, whereas the Son and the Spirit have existence through the Father or through another. And for me, this is problematic. On the one hand, Dr. Branson would admit this because that's sort of the point of monarchical Trinitarianism, is that the monarchy speaks to the Father. The Father has this sort of elevated status that the Son and the Spirit don't.
And that's important to his self-identity as monotheist, right? It is sort of the elevated status of the Father.
Yeah, because his understanding is that the church fathers, the way they thought of it is that to have more than one uncaused cause would just mean to have more than one God. So you didn't have typically the word monotheism. You had this understanding of the monarchy, and then you had a
Mhm.
polyarchy. The polyarchy just meant more than one cause. And so his understanding is that he has a historical perspective that to have more than one uncaused cause would literally result in polytheism. And this is problematic. So, on the one hand, you want to avoid that, which I understand. And that's where the monarchy comes into play, because the Father is the only mono, he's the only uncaused cause. But the other issue, and the thing is, a lot of modern day, especially Protestant Christians who are not familiar with this whole tradition, they hear this and they're like, whoa, this is like Arianism or
Yeah.
subordinationism, because you're totally downgrading the Son and the Spirit, and it's the opposite of what's called sometimes egalitarianism, which
Mhm.
is the idea that each one of the persons are exactly co-equal, co-eternal, kind of like the Athanasian Creed
Right.
says.
There's nothing more special about one of them than the others, right?
Right. Mhm.
If modern evangelical Trinitarians know anything, they have that gut instinct that you can't make one of the persons slightly more special than the other.
Exactly, exactly. And so Bo's model denies this. I mean, it doesn't have a problem with it. So on the one hand, I understand his motivation. It seems to be the historical view that's in the early some of the early fathers, especially in the Nicene Creed, the pro-Nicene fathers. And but on the other hand, I do agree with the kind of pushback from or sort of the natural reaction that a modern day Protestant would have to it, is that it seems to be a form of subordinationism, in the sense that the Father has a certain superior role or status that he occupies, that the Son and the Spirit don't. And that just seems to me to be at odds with a
The
typical way
spirit
of
of
understanding.
Trinitarianism or something.
Yeah, yeah, it just seems to be at odds with this the spirit of Trinitarianism. And I may have a certain bias against it, but the other problem is that, as I said, the idea of aseity and self-sufficiency, if we understand that those two attributes to be necessary attributes of God, and only the Father has it, then I wouldn't be comfortable saying that the Son and the Spirit are God.
Are
And on the
fully
one hand,
divine, are
yeah,
divine in the same way that God the Father
it,
is. Yeah.
exactly. And on the one hand, it seems like Dr. Branson would agree, and he'd be like, yeah, well, that's why the Father is only God in the ultimate sense. But then at the same time, you're calling the Son and the Spirit divine. It's like, whoa, wait, hold
Yeah.
on a minute. Then what does it mean to be divine? So, yeah, for me, that's a problem. And
And
then,
I feel like an effect of that is that sort of demotes the importance of aseity, right? In a
mhm,
certain kind of way. Like when I hear Bo talk, and especially when he was talking with you, it sometimes seems like he thinks that aseity is just the matter of the fact that the Father is not, related to anyone in that way, right? But it's
mhm,
not like there's something about him that makes him that way, right?
mhm,
Or that it's like, to me it seems like the person who is ase has to have the special property of being capable of being ase, right? Or
right,
something like that. Like it's such
right,
a special designation that it's not just like, oh, it's not like God looks behind him in the causal chain and is like, oh, there's no one behind me, I guess, whatever, I guess I'm the ase one then.
right, right,
It's
right,
like that's what's unique about him being God, right?
mhm,
And then
right,
it seems like Bo needs to bring that down a step to be like, well, you don't, you can still be fully God but not be ase. And it's just the circumstance that the Father is that person, and there's nothing really more special to it than that. Whereas to me, it
right.
seems like that's a very, very special thing, and that's part of what we mean when we talk about God, is the thing that requires no other explanation.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And that's why I actually had another debate, or actually had two debates with another Christian scholar by the name of Dr. Joshua Sijuwadi. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work or if you've seen my discussions with him, but he actually represents a sort of similar view in terms of Dr. Branson about the monarchy of the Father, and in terms of this idea of aseity. And he just, they both just sort of bite the bullet and admit, well, look, yeah, only the Father is ase, and the Son and the Spirit aren't. But yeah, that's just, to me, it is a fundamental issue. The second issue, which I think is also equally important, is there's a dilemma that arises out of this idea of eternally begetting. And the eternally begetting, because it's causation, it's an eternal action that the Father takes. The question is it a necessary act or is it a contingent act? And this is a dilemma that arises out of this problem. And that is because if you say that the act is necessary, then that means that the Father undergoes an action that is not free. He didn't freely choose to do this. Now, that seems to be at odds with the classical understanding that God is ultimately free, that he's omnipotent and has absolute freedom of the will to do as he pleases. And so if God has to, or by necessity, has to perform this action, then that seems to cast doubt on the fact that the Father, at least, is free in the ultimate sense, and at least that action. On the other hand, if you say that it was a contingent act of the Father, well, then that makes the Son and the Spirit contingent beings, because they're only contingently brought into existence by the Father, and the Father could have chosen to do otherwise. And we want to say, in order to be God, you need to have a necessary existence. So on the one hand, you cast doubt on the Father's omnipotence or his absolute freedom to do as he pleases, which seems to be a necessary attribute of God. So on the one hand, if you go the necessary route, which I think Bo and Dr. Josh as well would seem to kind of favor that route, it seems to cast doubt on the Father's freedom. And if the Father isn't free, well, then he's not truly God. On the flip side, if it's a contingent act, then the Son and the Spirit are contingent acts of the Father, and they're not necessary, therefore they're not God.
Right.
So
And
it seems like a serious problem.
I believe Eunomius, the famous Arian, I think made that similar point too. I think that was something that particular argument, even against monarchical Trinitarianism, was around in, like, say, I don't know, the early 5th century or something.
Yes, exactly. And there's actually a recent paper written by Dr. Ryan T. Mullins. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work, in which he kind of built, and he's a Trinitarian Christian, Protestant, but he rejects the sort of Nicene understanding of eternal generation, and specifically for this reason. Two main arguments he gives are the exact same ones that I gave in my debate with Bo, and then the ones that I'm giving right now. And it's interesting that he's a Christian and I'm a Muslim, and I mean, I swear to God, I did not read his paper and come up with that understanding. But then afterwards, I found his work and I said, wow, he's arguing the exact same points that I was arguing against my opponents in the debates. And we came to the same conclusion sort of independently. So I thought that, well, that was so interesting. I got to contact this guy. So I contacted him, and he's going to be coming on my my YouTube channel next month to discuss that issue. But you're right, he actually brings up Eunomius in his paper, and his paper, just to give him a plug, it's called Hasker on the Divine Processions, and I'd really recommend anybody to read it. It's only about maybe 30 pages. It's a nice, easy read. And he gives that argument from Eunomius, and he sort of builds on it and expands on it. But those are the two main arguments he gives, that, well, the problem with monarchical Trinitarianism is that it casts doubt on the Son and the Spirit's aseity and self-existence, which is a huge problem, and also the sort of Eunomian dilemma of either necessary or contingent. And either way you go, it's going to be a problem. So I think
Mhm.
those are serious issues for Bo's model. On the other hand, what I will grant Bo is, and this is something I'm gonna, question Dr. Mullins about, is as a Christian, he admits that that is sort of the historical understanding and what the fathers were trying to say in the Nicene Creed when they said that the Son was eternally begotten of the Father. So the question he has to wrestle with or try to deal with is, how do you explain that in the first ecumenical council, these church fathers got it so fundamentally wrong, and God somehow allowed the church from that point on all the way throughout history, for most Christian theologians, even the reformers, people like Calvin and Aquinas, they all sort of
Mhm.
affirm this idea. How do you explain that disunity and misunderstanding of a fundamental doctrine within the church? And so, yeah, I mean, even you, not to pick on you, but as a Unitarian Christian, that's something you guys have to deal with, right? Like that's
Yeah.
a serious concern. Yeah, so yeah, he's gonna have to. He does try to answer it, but he bites the bullet. I mean, he doesn't deny it. He admits, hey, look, this is a historical answer, and yeah, I have to come up with an alternative way of looking at how I solve that problem.
Mhm. Yeah. So I guess what do you think of Unitarian Christianity? Because
Hmm.
I think that one way that if I were to describe our strengths and weaknesses, like I don't think I've never really heard a good argument why we have any philosophical problems. I think everyone's sort of
Hmm.
like, well, yeah, actually that's just pretty simple and that makes sense, I suppose. But
Hmm.
um, but either the Christian tradition was very wrong either for a long period of time or in a large majority, right?
Hmm.
um, and so that's one of Unitarian's biggest problems. So it's like, so what about from say like 450 AD till the Reformation? There were just like none of you guys, and then you
Hmm.
reappear, and like, how do you explain that, right? And so
Hmm.
that's a difficulty that we have. And then I think the other
Hmm.
difficulty is sort of the worship question. Like,
Hmm.
that you guys seem to give Jesus something that looks pretty darn close to religious worship. How can you do that if he's not God, right? And that's
Hmm.
not particularly a problem that Trinitarianism has. I feel like
Hmm.
those are biblical Unitarians' biggest weaknesses. But as far as I've heard so far, we don't have any philosophical weaknesses.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, specifically on the Unitarian picture, I would agree with you. Like, as far as the tradition and the historical perspective goes, I know Dr. Tuggy has argued for certain early church fathers that they were actually Unitarians, and I think you can make a sort of strong case for that. I think the problem is that the overall picture, I mean, the question actually comes is, why did God somehow allow this to happen? Why didn't he take better care of the church in this situation as far as providentially guiding them into right doctrine? Yeah, I think that's a fundamental issue. And then the second thing is, I mean, I don't know, because I know there are different strands of Unitarianism. It's not a complete monolith. I think you've even had some discussions amongst Unitarians on here where you guys disagreed on certain points. So I don't know, Sam, what is your understanding of the relationship between God the Father and Jesus Christ and worship? Like, what is your understanding of that?
Sure. So, I mean, I think that the first quick sentence that I think you and I will agree with, and that pretty much everyone understands, is that there's just one personal God, right? God is unipersonal. He's all of those attributes that we've kind of already talked about, and that he is worthy and deserving of worship, and that I would understand. Uh, you know, I honestly am still kind of feel like I'm wading my way through the worship question a little bit, and like perhaps increasing in nuance and sophistication. Because, like, growing up, we perhaps we weren't given like super detailed philosophical reasons as to why we did what we did. We just did it, you know, and
Mhm.
it feels natural. And then you kind of like have to like figure out, okay, so how exactly, what's the best explanation that makes sense of what we are doing and how it feels from the inside and how we would
Mhm.
explain and justify it. And I think that we are totally fine with saying that Jesus is subordinate to God the Father in every way that you can imagine being subordinate. You know, pick
Mhm.
a definition of subordinate, and yes, Jesus is that to God. And
Yeah.
so that it's not like God, it's not like Jesus has ascended to a place where he is equal to God or has sort of displaced God or become, you know, a second God equal to God the Father or something like that. That's
Mhm.
just certainly not the case. I think one of the most important ways to understand who Jesus is and what his role is now is he's sort of like the heavenly eternal high priest. And right, that's
Mhm.
a common theme throughout the New Testament is Jesus's role as high priest. And
Mhm.
what's the role of a high priest? The role of a high priest is to lead the congregation in worship of God. So Jesus even now worships God. And Jesus sort
Mhm.
of from his heavenly exalted state above the church is sort of like, you know, the heavenly worship leader
Mhm.
in the throne room of God. So Jesus
Mhm.
still worships God. God is still Jesus's God, right?
Mhm.
To have a God is sort of the ultimate act of subservience, right?
Mhm.
And so God is still Jesus's God, but we will worship Jesus in the sense that we feel like this is what God has commanded and this is what God expects. And all worship to God, in a sense, is sort of funneled through Jesus, right? He
Mhm.
is like the focal point through whom God is accessed now.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that apart from Jesus, you can't worship God appropriately, and that worshiping Jesus is worshiping God appropriately.
Mhm.
And the like some precedent that we would explain for that in like at the end of the book of Chronicles, I think it's like First Chronicles 29 or something like that. It's like near the end of King David's life, and there's like he's about to hand the throne over to King Solomon, his son, and there's a scene where the whole assembly of Israel bows down and worships King David and God, right? It's
Mhm.
like God is up in heaven. King David is, in a sense, God's earthly representative, right? And he is
Mhm.
like sort of imaging God both as a human being and as sort of God's authoritative, empowered ruler on earth. And so it's
Mhm.
like recognizing God kind of in and through King David.
Mhm.
And that's sort of like, and you know, I think a lot of actual biblical commentators sort of get that idea, and it's I think that idea is sort of coming back into realization as people better understand the Old Testament context, that there was a sense in which, you know, you worshiped and acknowledged the king as king, and that was sort of acknowledging and worshiping God, who was sort of the power behind the throne. And so it's
Mhm.
sort of like Jesus is that, but like in a heavenly, even more exalted sense, right? Like
Mhm.
Jesus is even more powerful and more kind of eternally the king than even King David was. So
Mhm.
I guess that's sort of how I would explain it briefly. That wasn't
Mhm.
super brief, but that's the
Yeah.
general idea.
So he's like the sort of intermediary as far as worship goes.
Right.
Um, yeah. I mean, for me, obviously, I wouldn't, based on what I already said earlier, I wouldn't be comfortable with it. Um, as far as philosophically goes, I mean, I think I would probably try to argue from a textual perspective that it seems that worships, I understand what you're saying about King David, so I'm not trying to push back too much on that
Mhm.
because I would have to go and look at the passages, but um it seems that worship is due to God alone. I mean, this is like for us as Muslims, it's a fundamental principle. Now there might be sort of a bridge, uh, certainly between what you're saying and more of Dr. Andani's perspective and things like that. But I just want to read like a verse in the Quran that popped in my head when you were talking about it. So in chapter 39, verse 3, it says, unquestionably, for Allah is the pure religion, and those who take protectors besides him say, we only worship them that they may bring us nearer to Allah in position. Indeed, Allah will judge between them concerning that over which they differ. Indeed, Allah does not guide he who is a liar and disbeliever. So I'm not using this as a philosophical argument, but I'm saying that this is the kind of idea that I get in my mind where people say, well, we only worship Jesus, or we only worship this saint, or we only do worship such and such to get closer to God because he's somehow like beyond us. We can't access him directly. And for me, I have an issue with that. I think God, if he's truly perfect, we should be able to access him directly. And I don't see any reason why we couldn't. I mean, it's not like he's radioactive or anything in any sense. I mean, he should be able to hear our prayers and listen to us, and we should be able to worship him directly. That's just what I would say in response as to just how I feel about it. But as far as a rigorous philosophical argument, I don't know if I could come up with one off the top of my
Sure.
head. But yeah, I would just take issue with the fact of not worshiping God alone in the ultimate sense. But I'm
And
interested.
I think that I would say, this is honestly something that I still feel like I'm kind of wrestling and teasing out, is like, do I worship Jesus and God in sort of like some sort of different sense? Like a Catholic would say, right, you can venerate Mary, but you only worship members of the Trinity, right?
Yeah,
And sometimes that distinction in practice seems very thin indeed.
yeah.
But it's still perhaps a distinction. So do I think that I worship Jesus categorically different than I worship God? I'm honestly not sure. And I think that in my mind, it's more like I worship them in hierarchy, right? Like
Mhm,
there is some sense in which ultimate praise and ultimate worship is only due to God alone, right? And
mhm,
that's something that even Jesus himself gives to God, right?
mhm,
And that Jesus is not the recipient of. Maybe he's the intermediary through, but he's not the final destination of it. But like
mhm,
there's some perhaps, hierarchical distinction or gradation in the worship Jesus receives, maybe than a categorical distinction is what
mhm.
seems to make sense in my mind.
Right. Now, as far as Jesus goes, if you don't mind me asking you another question, um, how, because I think there's and I'm not too clued up on this because as you can see I'm busy with the Trinitarians, but there seems to be different Unitarian perspectives as far as like Jesus, whether or not he's eternal or he was created at the conception of Mary or maybe at some time before that. Like what is your view, or maybe you can give like an overall sketch of some of the
Sure.
differences.
I think that there's sort of a split in Unitarianism, although nowadays there's really one sort of main group. But back even like 200 years ago, there was more of an even divide between those that would affirm Jesus's personal preexistence in some sense, and those would say that Jesus's person began in the womb of Mary, and
Mhm,
that I'm firmly in the camp that I think that Jesus's existence began in the womb of Mary, and that he didn't have any his identity and personal, self-awareness did not exist before his human existence. But there
mhm,
are some Unitarians who do say that, and really they're pretty similar to historical Arians, is basically
mhm,
the gist of it. Although honestly, there are some biblical Unitarians that when I read them, I'm like, I think that you and Bo Branson actually just kind of agree, and that you were just disagreeing with egalitarian Trinitarians, and then
Yeah,
you
yeah,
basically reverse engineered monarchical Trinitarianism again, and just
right,
called it Unitarianism. And because it's funny, Dale Tuggy will sometimes classify Bo Branson as a Unitarian, which I think
yeah,
kind of rubs Bo the wrong way, but he kind of knows what he means. And that's
yeah,
because, like, since the Protestant Reformation, there were some Unitarians that were basically monarchical Trinitarians. They just
right,
had a different label. And
right,
so, but I think that the majority of biblical Unitarians alive today, and I would include myself among them, just think that that's somehow incompatible with Jesus's full humanity, right? We
hmm,
didn't really talk about the incarnation much, but
hmm,
like, I think that you and I would agree that it's just kind of hard to imagine how you get a real, genuine human being out of
hmm,
an incarnation process. And
hmm,
so whether you believe that Jesus is, eternal and co-equal or co-divine with the Father, or some sort of second form of divinity, like a second class deity that was
hmm,
incarnated, which is sort of what the Arians thought and what some
hmm,
biblical Unitarians think. It just doesn't seem to me like you have a human being afterwards. Like,
hmm,
it's like you have superficial humanity, but like deep essential divinity, and that's just not what a human being is. So
hmm,
I'm like, the first thing that I think you need to start with to understand who Jesus was is that he's just a genuine human being, right? He's
hmm,
a human being in the same sense that you and I are. There's some differences, right? He was sinless, and he was born of a miraculous conception in a virgin, which wasn't the case with me, and I haven't met anyone else that was the case for, and stuff. So he
hmm,
has some distinctives, but at the end of the day, he's a human being. So
yeah,
so I think that is one of the reasons why I just find personal preexistence to be at odds with kind of both reason and the biblical revelation.
hmm. Yeah, it's just I think maybe they get that idea from certain passages in the Bible, like that Christ is the firstborn of all creation and these kind of things.
Hmm.
So, yeah, and I think maybe the difference between, to be fair to Bo, maybe the difference between hit, or at least one of the key differences, is that in his understanding, even though the Son is caused by the Father, it's eternal. Whereas with this understanding of Arianism, or at least classical Arianism, he always said there was a time where the Son was not. This was kind of
Hmm.
like a nursery rhyme almost. And so he was created maybe way back in the distant past,
And he
sometime.
was the
uh,
first thing, yeah.
yeah, it was the first thing, but it wasn't an eternal cause in the same way that, like, you were talking about with like logic and mathematics.
Yeah.
There's, to be fair to Bo, there is a difference between the two. Now, whether or not you think eternal causation makes sense, that's another story. But yeah, there definitely, under Bo's model, there was not a time when the Son was not. Whereas probably with even biblical Unitarianism, that's sort of like classical Arianism, would say, well, he was created way back in the distant past. It wasn't at the conception of Mary, but or the birth, yeah, but there was in a time where the Son wasn't. It
Yeah.
wasn't an eternal thing.
And
So,
like the
yeah,
question that you asked earlier, they would be fine saying Jesus was contingent, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
that was, the Arians were, owned that. It was like, yeah, Jesus is contingent, and that's one of the distinctives between him and the Father, and that's why the Father is kind of a truer God, a higher God, right?
exactly,
Hmm.
exactly. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, what is Dr. Tuggy's position? Is his position what you said?
He was a Arian style Unitarian for a while, and then I think had his mind changed and is a non-personal pre-existence. Sometimes that's called Socinianism. There was a Protestant reformer named Socinus, who are
Mm,
Sozzini and I think Italian, and then Socinus in sort of a Latin name, and so that's
mm,
sometimes called Socinianism. Is to just say that Jesus just is a man who began to exist in the womb of Mary.
right. Well, that's interesting. I learned some things here too.
Mhm. So I guess, do you have you probably have some biblical passages that you think that are a problem for me.
Mhm,
I would be, because I've heard you in some of your lectures, you certainly point out that there are really difficult passages for Trinitarians in the Bible, but I suspect you
mhm,
also think that there are some difficult passages for me. So I would wonder what those are, and if maybe I could have the chance to clarify for that.
mhm. Trying to think off the top of my head. So I think Bo gives the example. Is it Hebrews 1:3? Let me look it up. Let me see if I could pull it up
Yeah,
real
where are you
fast.
talking about where Jesus is called Hotheos?
Yeah. Yeah. Is it? I'm just thinking off the top of my head. Is it
It's either
Hebrews 1:3?
1:1 or 1:3, or it's 1:8 is where he gets called your throne, O God.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
That's okay.
So, yeah. So, what do you make of that passage? Because it seems like a strong passage where he's literally called Hatheos, the God.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I'll a couple things to explain that passage. One, it's quoting a psalm. It's quoting Psalm 45 from the Old Testament. So that passage isn't like new in the New Testament. It's an Old Testament passage, and in
Hmm.
its original context, it refers to King Hezekiah. And so
Hmm.
I would say that it has that the book of Hebrews is showing that that psalm has a Christological sort of reinterpretation, right, and a
Hmm.
Christological new application. But in its original context, it wasn't a messianic psalm. It
Hmm.
was a song praising King Hezekiah, and that in Hebrew it's Elohim, right?
Hmm.
It's not God's name. It's not your throne, God's name, it's your throne, Elohim, which is a broader word than I think a lot of people realize, right? Like kings get called Elohim multiple times in the Old Testament. Moses
Yeah.
does, judges do, angels do, pagan gods, get called Elohim, right? It's a pretty broad word that can be used for humans. And so I think that this is showing that Jesus is kind of the full fulfillment of that psalm, right? About the
Hmm.
unending kingdom and stuff like that. But if you read it through, your throne, O God, and I do agree that that's referring to Jesus there, is forever and ever. The scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. So it's pretty clear, even in that same quotation, that who the king who is being referred to with the word God is not the highest God, right? And has a God over him, right? And
Hmm.
that's, you know, God with a capital G. And as far as it being Hotheos, I don't think it's like referring to Jesus as like the God. It's more like it's like a poetic O, right? That's how it normally gets translated in English. Like your throne, O God. It sounds a little weird in English, but it's like one of those little poetic syllables that just kind of makes it sound a little fancy. So I don't actually
Hmm.
think that it's calling Jesus the God. I think it's
Hmm.
like, oh God, in sort of a poetic sense, but it just happens to be the same phrase. But it's still clear
Hmm.
that there's a God above that God. And I would also
Hmm.
point out another thing that honestly, this just makes everyone uncomfortable, is that the word Hotheos is also used to refer to Satan one time in the New
Hmm.
Testament. In Second
Yeah.
Corinthians 4:4, maybe, or 4:2, something like that, it
Yeah.
calls Satan the god of this age, right, or
Yeah.
the god of
Yeah.
this world.
Yeah.
And so even the phrase Hotheos can sometimes refer to someone other than God, and I think this is just one of the examples. And so
Hmm.
I think it's pretty clear that there is a sense in which you can call humans, especially really important humans like kings, God, but it's
Hmm.
still not God in the capital G highest sense.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. I get that. What about in passage like I think it's John 1:18 where it says no one has ever seen God. And then depending on what variant you go with, either the monogenes theos, the only God, or the only begotten son. How do you understand that if we have these theophanies in the Old Testament, and it's not referring to the Son as God, then who did they see? I mean, what do you imagine these theophanies being about in the Old Testament?
Sure. So first I'll refer just to the text of John 1:18. You're right, and you're quite well informed to know that that specific verse has some textual arguments about what is the original version of that passage. There's sort of like three main choices. No one
Hmm.
has ever seen God, but the only begotten Son has,
Hmm.
has made him known. That's the version that I
Hmm.
think is correct for the record. And then there's no one has ever seen God, the only begotten God.
Hmm.
That's one of the choices. And then there's no one has ever seen God, the only begotten Son, who is also God. He
Hmm.
has made him known. And I think that that third one is pretty clearly not the right answer, even though the NIV still uses it for, I think, quite theologically motivated reasons. But
Hmm.
I think that this was one of those battleground texts in early Christianity that people manipulated to suit their theology. Like, no one has ever seen God, the only begotten God. That's actually just Arianism, right? I actually think that's
Hmm.
the sort of the Arian insertion that some translations still use. Like I'm looking at ESV and they use that version. I think, but the only begotten God is like a phrase that never appears anywhere else in the New Testament, whereas the only begotten Son is a phrase that appears multiple times, especially in the Gospel of John. So it makes sense
Hmm.
that this passage would be in conformity with the language elsewhere in the same book. And so I
Hmm.
think that no one has ever seen God, the only begotten Son, who's in the bosom of the Father, he has made him known. I actually think that's one of the hardest texts for Trinitarians to deal with, right? No one has
Hmm.
seen God. Okay, well, did you see Jesus? Okay, you saw or people saw Jesus, therefore, I think that's a pretty difficult text for Trinitarians. But okay, moving on to your theophany question, I basically just would say that all of the theophanies in the Old Testament were angels. And that I think that's actually a pretty clear theme in the book of Hebrews, is that God previously interacted with humanity through angels. And like when Stephen is being stoned in the book of Acts, right, he says that God appeared to Moses in an angel on Mount Sinai. And I
Hmm.
think in the book of Galatians, Paul also says that the old covenant was mediated by angels. So I actually think that's one of the differences that Jesus's ascension into heaven accomplishes, is that previously we interacted with God through angels in the Old Testament. And so therefore the whole old covenant was mediated through angels, and all of the theophanies were angels. And that Jesus now has ascended above the angels, which is a very important teaching in the book of Hebrews, and that we have direct access to God through a human being now instead of through an angel mediary. So
Hmm.
that's how I would explain that. And I actually think that certain passages in Hebrews are a very difficult problem for people like Bo Branson, who say that Jesus was the angel of the Lord and that Jesus was the theophanizer, or however you would put that in the Old Testament, right? Because, Hebrews 1 says, 1:1, long ago at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. So if Jesus was speaking to Moses as the person
Hmm.
on the theophany in Mount Sinai, and if Jesus was giving revelation to various prophets in the Old Testament, why would it say, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son? That just seems
Hmm.
incongruous with the idea that Jesus was somehow the mediator between the highest God and humans prior to his ascension into heaven after the resurrection. So I
Hmm.
think there's a lot of biblical problems with that idea.
Hmm. All right, let me give you one more.
Sure.
So in John 12, I think it's 41 I've got here, when it talks about, it says, Isaiah said these things because he saw his glory and spoke of him. And when you look at that, the glory that's being spoken of in Isaiah is Yahweh's glory. And
Mhm.
John seems, the Trinitarian argument, or what they're claiming here, is that John is applying that passage in Isaiah about seeing God's glory to the Son himself. And so it seems to be saying that in some sense the Son is Yahweh.
Yeah,
So
I
how would you respond to that?
there are multiple passages like that where a prophecy in the Old Testament that specifically mentions Yahweh as the actor, right, or the accomplisher of the prophecy, are then applied to Jesus in the New Testament as this was fulfilled in Jesus, right? So it seems like pretty clear. Well, if Yahweh suddenly comes to his temple and we're saying that that prophecy is fulfilled by Jesus coming, it's like, so therefore Jesus is Yahweh. And I would say, and this is where actually I kind of agree with Bo a little bit, is that Jesus is in such perfect cooperation with God that God doing something through Jesus is as if God is doing it, right? When
Hmm.
Jesus does something, it's as if, God did it. It's also sort of like the question, like, who brought the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt? Did God bring the Hebrews out of slavery, or did Moses bring the Hebrews out of slavery? It's like, well,
Hmm.
yes, to both of those questions, right? God was acting in Moses to bring the Hebrews out of slavery. So I would
Hmm.
say that Jesus is the perfect agent of God, such that God accomplishes what had been prophesied that God would do in Jesus. But that doesn't mean that Jesus is God. Jesus is the agent and the proximate, accomplisher of the promises, but God is the ultimate accomplisher of the promises. And I would also say that there's a lot of passages in the New Testament about God giving glory to Jesus, even his own glory, right? Especially in the book of John, where, where God bestows God's own glory onto Jesus because Jesus has, in some sense, earned it and deserves it. And that's sort of similar to the worship conversation earlier. So I do think that Jesus, in some sense, has God's glory on him, but it's not intrinsic to him. It is received from him whom it is intrinsic to. And so that's sort of how I'd answer that God accomplishes things through Jesus, and God bestows his own glory uniquely onto Jesus.
Hmm. All right. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to make it seem like I'm trying to
No, that's
say that
fine.
the biblical understanding is Trinitarian, because I don't actually think that's the case. I think you can try to argue it, but I don't actually think it is a full orb Trinitarian view. I'm just trying to play,
Sure.
as if
I,
I got
I'm
my Trinitarian hat on. That's
yeah,
all.
I'm
Yeah.
curious, what would you say, what makes sense to you as sort of the biblical view of Jesus?
Oh, so I think definitely when it comes to John and Paul specifically, um, and I hold this position tentatively, I would say it seems to me that Jesus is some kind of divine being, but a lesser divine being. Definitely not God in the ultimate sense of the Father, because he has a God, which is the Father. Um, but he's just not merely a prophet either, in the way that a Muslim would think. Seems to be a bit more than that, and something akin to a sort of quasi divine being. I think that's what I would, at least
Hmm.
right now, is my
Hmm.
understanding.
So kind of like Arianism, basically.
Yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. Now, and as far as exactly when that being came into existence, I don't know. I think that's sort of an open question. Yeah, but I'm interested actually. What what is maybe some maybe one or two verses that you think are sort of the biggest problems for Trinitarians, and that you think would support a Unitarian view?
I would say, I think one of the biggest problems for pre-existence people, or Arianish people, would be, in what sense did Jesus get exalted to heaven, right? Because, like, man, I could probably quote 50 or more passages that talk about Jesus being exalted to heaven, or newly seated at the right hand of God, and all of those sorts of things, right? That's just a
Hmm.
huge New Testament theme that's just like in virtually every book of the New Testament
Hmm.
talks about the exaltation of Jesus. And it's like, that's not how you talk about a return trip, you know, right?
Yeah.
That's how you talk about a new thing happening, right? And the book
Mhm.
of Hebrews is so specific that like Jesus newly enters into the presence of God covered in his own blood. You know, I don't mean to trigger you with atonement stuff too much, but like, and has entered into the heavenly holy of holies to give, you know, a living sacrifice of himself to God, right? And that's like
Mhm.
a new thing. And it's like, so had Jesus never been in the heavenly holy of holies before? You know,
Mhm.
that's certainly what Hebrews says. So I think that
Mhm.
sort of exaltation language is very difficult. And they'll say like, oh, it's via his human nature. But I think
Mhm.
you correctly, you know, identified that that language doesn't really seem to mean anything in the final analysis.
Yeah.
And I think that also at the beginning of Matthew, when it's talking about the virgin birth, it uses the word, and this is like the origin of Jesus. It's like, you
Mhm.
know, it, it's like, why would you use that phrase? Why it seems to specifically say, and then the angel says, for this reason, because the Holy Spirit will come upon you, Virgin Mary, he is to be called the Son of God, right? It's
Mhm.
not, the angel doesn't say, because he was begotten before all ages, or the first begotten creature in eternity past, or something like that. It's because he's born of the Virgin Mary miraculously that he is to be called the Son of God. And so
Mhm.
so the word begotten, you know, there's no use of the word begotten in the New Testament that seems to refer to anything other than Jesus's conception as a human being. There's no
Mhm.
use of the word begotten that seems to mean eternity past,
Mhm.
or the first act of creation, or what have you. So
Mhm.
that's another thing that's challenging. And really also at the end of the day, I think, you know, the Bible just portrays Jesus as a human, right? The number of
Mhm.
times Jesus calls himself a human multiple times. And
Mhm.
so I just don't think that that's a human being at the end of the day, if you think that that's what happened. So
Mhm.
I think those, you know, those aren't specific, well, I kind of pointed out specific passages, but sort of overall themes. And I
Mhm.
think, yeah, there are some verses in John that give me difficulty. Yeah, honestly, the book of John is a little bit weird, and I sometimes struggle with it. I think it is
Mhm.
the easiest book to make a Arianish case from. I think Paul is actually pretty easy to do the opposite. I think there's only one or two passages that people use in Paul to try and argue his preexistence, and they're pretty easy to rebut. And there's a lot of passages in Paul that it's easy to make the opposite case for. So I actually
Mhm.
think it's pretty clear in Paul that he was a biblical Unitarian, and there's a good number of scholars that actually agree with that. So
Mhm.
that's how I would put it, I guess.
Mhm. It's interesting because John is always said to have like an extremely high Christology, but I find one of the key passages in the New Testament that seems to rebut the idea that he's God in the ultimate sense is in John chapter 17, verse 3, which it says, you know, this is life eternal, that they may know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom thou hast sent.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's like, whoa, I mean, Jesus has a God, which is the Father, which is the only true God. And this is like, he's telling you, if you want to know anything, this is eternal life, that you should know that the Father is the only true God and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent.
Yeah.
Well, that almost sounds like the Muslim
That almost
narrative
sounds
because
Islamic, right? Yeah.
yeah, because like that's our view, like what the prophets would come with. This is the only true God. The Father's the only true God, and Jesus Christ is the prophet whom he has sent. And
Right.
so, you know, I'm not saying that John had the same exact view as Muslims do, but I would say that it's a bit perplexing because it seems to me that it sort of rules out a full orbed view of the Trinity because well, look, if the Father's the only true God and you say someone else is a God besides that, well, then they're just a false God by extension, right? So,
Right.
yeah, so I always found that as a very difficult passage. But one last question, if I could have for you, because I'm just a little curious about your journey. Were you always a Unitarian, or did you transition to become a Unitarian? And I'm wondering if you did change your mind about it, was it primarily due to textual issues, or was it more philosophically motivated, like kind of the angle that I'm coming from,
Mhm.
that it doesn't make sense, so let me go back and look at it, and then you kind of found this Unitarian picture? Like, what was it primarily motivated by, more philosophical or
I
textual?
I actually grew up biblical Unitarian.
Oh, you did?
There are
Okay.
not very that's kind of a minority nowadays, even within biblical Unitarianism, to have grown up that way. But
Hmm.
I actually did, and I actually go to a Trinitarian church now, and
Mm,
I have been excommunicated from a Trinitarian church before for my
mm,
beliefs, and so there was a time in college where basically I was kind of getting kicked out of a Christian group for my beliefs, and I hadn't really thought too much about it myself before. And I sort of kind of restudied this subject kind of for my own for the first time at about age 19 or something like that. And
mhm,
honestly, I think that I was kind of trying to convince myself to become a Trinitarian because that would have solved some social problems that I was having. And it
mhm.
just didn't happen. And I
Yeah.
think that I became kind of more convinced. I think that really I think that the biblical evidence is pretty clear. I think the book of John is a little challenging. Like you said, I think if anything, John is Arian, right?
Mhm,
Because the subordination in the book of John is actually clearer than any other book in the whole New Testament. Like Jesus
mhm,
repeatedly says, "I don't say anything except what God tells me to say. I don't do anything except what God tells me to do. I can't do
mhm,
anything apart from God. I'm just doing what God." Like he says that sort of stuff all the time in the book of John. And so the
mhm,
subordination is clear. So at best it's Arian, and
mhm,
I think you can actually make a pretty good biblical Unitarian non-pre-existent case for it. And then I
mhm,
think the rest of the Bible or the rest of the New Testament is just especially clear. Like the Synoptic Gospels, it's like honestly it's just I'm almost at the point where it's just like it is a fault of basic reading comprehension if you think that Jesus is anything other than a human being in the
mhm,
Synoptic Gospels. Is that just seems clear to me. And books like the book of Hebrews and Revelation I think are also very, very clear. And so
mhm,
I think that while John and a couple passages in Paul are a little bit difficult to work with, I think that they are often unclear passages that are difficult to work with, and passages that seem to lend themselves to multiple interpretations, whereas other passages that are perfectly clear and hard to give any other interpretation to, like kind of trump those, I guess, and sort of say
mhm,
like, well, it must just be that it's not exactly the obvious reading in some parts of John that are the true ones if we're going to harmonize this all together. So
mhm,
that's really how I would put it. And I think philosophically, like I said, it's like Trinitarians just always seem to be tripping over themselves to try and figure out how to make this work. And it just
mhm,
seems like this constant task, this constant battle of trying to figure out how it works. And it's like,
mhm,
well, that just seems like kind of it's like a spiritual anchor around you or something like
mhm,
that. You can focus on other things and do other things. That biblical Unitarianism just doesn't weigh you down with. And I also think that it's pretty clear historically that the Trinity is a late development, and that the
mhm,
earlier you go in Christian history, the less Trinitarian it is, and the more people who look like what I think is the right answer there are. And so
mhm,
while I have the historical problem for that, sort of 1,000-year gap where there aren't really
mhm,
any biblical Unitarians, there the primacy of that view and the idea that it must have been the apostles' view themselves, and then
mhm,
also seemingly what Jesus taught, that
mhm,
it just seems like if Christianity is going to be anything, it has to be what the apostles themselves believed and what
mhm.
Jesus believed about himself. So I
Right,
just don't think that Trinitarians can get around that problem.
right, right. Well, I
Mhm.
appreciate you answering my questions, because I,
Sure.
I I got to learn a little bit about what you think, so I really enjoyed that.
Mhm. All right. Well, I honestly should probably get going pretty soon, but
Mhm,
but I've really enjoyed talking with you, Jake. I think that you're exceptionally curious and open-minded and a good conversation partner, and you just know a whole lot of stuff that is really rare even for Christians to know. and
Mhm.
that you've put this amount of effort and that you can clearly articulate it. I'm just really pleased to meet you and to get to talk with you.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed you having me on, and look forward to maybe future conversations.
All right, sounds good. I will turn off the recording.